So I hate to be the one to tell you this, and you're really not going to want to hear this, but I think today's episode is going to be pretty awesome.
Yay.
So today we're going to be talking about the power of words.
The power of now.
The time is now.
The power of words and vocabulary and the questions you ask and the things that you say to yourself in your head, the things that you tell other people, and how to just stop making your life as more hard than it really has to be in some situations, and stop doing that. And then you can also make it so much better by thinking about how important the words that you say are.
Yeah, that's right. The way that you use words and the type of words you use can really change the dynamic of a whole conversation. It's something that gives me, I literally get a guttural feeling where it brings on a sense of anxiety. If somebody, will text me or call me and be like, so I really have to tell you something, even just the tone that they use or starting a conversation that way, immediately I can feel like my stomach tense up. I hold my breath, and it's almost like if you're it's the same feeling if you've ever been in a car accident and you can see the other car approaching you almost like it's slow-mo and you're sort of bracing for that impact. That's what it feels like.
But you're the one who smashes into the other person.
I mean, we don't have to get into that, but yeah, it's almost like you're bracing for impact before the person has even delivered any information. And so it's going to change the dynamic of the whole conversation even before that information is delivered.
Yeah, because it immediately puts you on the defense. Jenna, I hate to tell you this, but anything I say
after that,
you're bracing for impact, you're bracing for defense, or it's you're gonna hate me for saying this, and then let's say you even just say something neutral like, I actually have the same shoes as you, but that person will take it a little harder than if you just said, I actually have those same shoes as you. So that's what we mean when we say making your life easier and then making it way better by just not putting your foot in your mouth before you've even started to say what you want to say. So we'll get into it with some examples like you were just saying. What's another example where you've done it or you've been in a conversation where someone starts a sentence like, you're gonna hate me, or I hate to tell you this, or so and so, whatever, yada yada yada?
Well, I can't think of a specific example off the top of my head, but I know there's been many times where that the information that you're going to deliver is perhaps less than ideal, or it's an unfortunate circumstance, or it's not something that the person is going to want to hear. And we, despite how much some of us avoid conflict and confrontation, these are conversations inevitably throughout your life. You're always going to have uncomfortable conversations.
Yeah.
And I used to be very guilty of that, of say I had to tell, whatever. I remember when I was in my early 20s and I dented my dad's truck, right? It's like you come home, and I'm sure at the time I probably worded it of Dad, you better sit down.
Yeah.
It's like you don't want to start a conversation that way. If I was going, or I guess what I try to do now, if I have to have these conversations, is I try to not tell people how they should feel about something before I've even delivered the information.
That's
because
important.
Perhaps you're going to deliver information that you might perceive as a hardship or less than ideal circumstances, or
and you also do it to kind of like soften the blow,
right?
But it only makes things worse.
It makes the impact so much worse.
You try to make it easier. If someone comes in to get fired and you're like the person firing them, it doesn't help.
You don't want to say, Bob, you're gonna hate me, but
it's like that scene in Moneyball where Brad Pitt and Jonah Hill, and he's like, "Hey, pretend you're firing me," and Jonah Hill is like a brand new intern in the job, and Brad Pitt's like, "What the hell are you talking about, man? Like, just would you rather take a bullet, like 10 bullets in the chest, or 1 bullet to the head?" And it's like, yeah, I guess just 1 to the head will do.
Yeah, just deliver the information. But with that being said, sometimes if you start a conversation in a certain way where you're already telling the person how to feel, had you just delivered the information in a neutral fashion, they might not have as exaggerated a reaction had you not already told them how they should feel before delivering the information.
They will listen to how you've told them to feel. 100%.
100%. So
they might not listen to anything else that you say, but usually if you like open a door for somebody and tell them like, okay, you're gonna feel like this, a lot of times they will.
Right.
And so that's a way to make things easier, is not tell somebody how they're gonna feel, just saying the information. I know it makes things easier to like try to soften the blow and like kind of drag things on and not just jumping into it, but it actually makes things worse. So that can be with so I guess the goal of today's episode, or what we sort of want to go through and talk about, is perhaps noticing. We bring this up so that you can notice in the past how you've delivered information to people. And we'll go through a lot of examples today. It's not just how you start the conversation, but it's also the type of words that you use while you're delivering information. Of course, non-verbal cues like tone and body language and some things like that play into it as well. But also how certain words that you use will also trigger people in certain ways, much like telling them how to feel at the start of the conversation. Yeah, like the order of words, what words, the volume, all that stuff. And you're not going to speak like a perfect robot every time. You're always, and that's always is one of those words, right? So
well, let's get into that right now, because that's one thing that I've learned from you. And again, it's very much changed. Well, it's changed how I interact, at work, with friends and family. But I would say it's also changed the way that we as a couple interact, and particularly around arguments. Because is the way that you use the words always and never.
Yeah, those absolute words.
Maybe you want to get into that a little bit, about what absolute words are and how it impacts how a conversation goes.
Well, basically the absolute words, that they don't leave any room for wiggle room. And as a guy, I can tell you that most guys will only want to make their partner happy. And a lot of like the little arguments we get into and the things that I take like more personal, it's when, let's say we're in this argument and we're talking about something in the present, and maybe I've made a mistake in the present, perhaps. And then you might say something in the past like, well, like, no, you've never done that, or you've always done that.
You can use it as an example. Like, we'll use a real life example that I think most, if not all, couples with struggle at some point, or people that are at least living in a same space. It doesn't even have to be a partner, but like a roommate or something like that, right? I think a common argument is people will argue about divvying up household tasks, cleaning, taking out the garbage, things like that, right? So there could be an example. There's definitely
Don't say it.
There's definitely been an example of, I'm like, well, I just cleaned this whole house, and now look at, you're leaving your dishes. You're leaving your dishes on the counter. You always leave your dishes on the counter. You never help me put away the dishes.
Right.
Even though that's obviously not true.
Right.
Because there's multiple circumstances where you do help empty the dishwasher, put away dishes, or something like that.
And so in the moment, females, or the more feminine like energy, will usually express things like through emotion of like, and use words in the emotion they feel of like, I feel like this right now, but I use the word of like always to kind of like hammer in that emotion.
Really, and just nail that.
And then the man, or the more like masculine energy one, will kind of take that for face value of like the word being like, oh, so she thinks I always do this, or I've never done that, which means everything I've done in the past
hasn't been appreciated,
hasn't been noticed
valued,
or appreciated. So then basically it's like, well, why the hell would I do anything for this person anymore if they haven't noticed it in the past, right?
Yeah.
So just by taking away those absolute words, and it's hard to do, but it makes everything else much easier, because I can guarantee you, if you do use those absolute words, like, you never do that. And let's say that once the argument has cooled down, that that's not true, that your partner has done those things. It's just maybe you do that more, or they don't do it as much as you want. That would be much better to say versus never, because that literally takes all the energy like out of that person, and it makes them feel like everything they've done previously is for naught. It's worthless. It hasn't been noticed, and there's nothing I can do because she hasn't noticed it before.
Right. And like, kind of like you were alluding to, it just leaves no place to go.
Yeah, it's it's a non-starter, right?
It's a non-starter. Yeah. If you never do this, and especially when you're angry and emotions are running high, it sort of gives the allure of, well, you've never done this and you'll never be able to do this. Like telling somebody, using absolutes is just a non-starter, in that people it sort of even discourages trying. Like there's nowhere to really even go from there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And another thing with absolutes, like, so the always, never, but also like everybody, let's say that you are having,
everybody hates you.
you're having like, you got drunk the night before with at like a friend's wedding or something like that. And maybe there was like one kind of event or interaction that happened, and then the next day you have those like Sunday scaries, whatever they would call it, and then you start using absolutes like, oh, I bet everybody's talking about that, or everybody hates me, or everybody saw that. And obviously that's an absolute, and it's hard to prove wrong. It's impossible to prove,
especially when you don't remember.
It's impossible to prove right, and it's impossible to prove wrong.
Right.
But you're just choosing that word, and then that word creates a thought, and that thought creates an emotion, and that emotion creates a behavior, and before you know it,
that behavior leads you calling in sick on Monday,
and the caterpillar sneezes, and then all the dinosaurs die.
Yeah, for sure. So that, again, that's one thing that you've taught me, and I certainly try to use, is just to stay away from absolutes when possible, because they are, I can say with almost 100% certainty, not true. Absolutes are never true. But you do bring up a good point just with respect to the, using that example of, say, getting drunk in a wedding and then Sunday scaries and feeling not good the next day. It's kind of a nice segue into, we're talking right now about words that you would use to verbalize and communicate with other people. But I think it's equally important to consider the words that you use when you're talking to yourself. We all have internal dialogues with ourselves literally constantly, all the time, every day. And much, I think, like the words that you use with other people can have impact. I would say equally, if not more, the words that you use when you're talking to yourself, and because arguably you talk to yourself more than anybody else, you know, they can also have huge impact on stress levels, anxiety, your perception of yourself, how you feel about yourself, how you perform day to day. And so, just equally as important to consider, I think.
So how do you do that? I think a good technique is just starting to write things down that you hear, that you say to yourself, and then seeing that on paper. And then being like, all right, would I give this piece of paper like to a friend to read? And be like, probably not.
Those are two, you've just kind of talked about and combined two things that's how I sort of like to practice my mindfulness about how I speak to myself. I'm pretty sure this is just like a popular viral thing on Instagram or something, but I've seen it pop up many times where it's like, you know, talk to yourself like you would talk to your best friend. Because so often we're so inclined to be so hard on ourselves and so negative on ourselves, even with your successes, right? Like maybe you've had a really great day, you feel like it was a really positive day, you contributed a lot, and then you come home at the end of the day and you start nitpicking what could have gone better throughout the day. I certainly, you know,
that's why we have a Zen garden
that's why we have a Zen garden we're sitting beside right now. You got to rake the stones in the garden.
It's fine, it's raked. I cleaned it up.
But yeah, like I've certainly, you know, experienced that, and it's something that I have worked on and I'm always trying to work on, is just, you know, you'll have this incredible day. Okay, I got up, I made it to work, I helped a lot of people, I came home, I did yoga, I ate really healthy today, I'm feeling like this is just a top-notch day. And then you'll sort of sink into the day and reflect on it and be like, oh, well, when I interacted with this person, I should have said this, I shouldn't have said that, I'm such an idiot, I could have done more here, right? And it's just that negative loop of self-talk. It can take what was a phenomenal day and just break it down to the point that it's less good. Whereas you think about it, it's like, okay, if I came home and told my partner or my sister or my best friend about this day, they would be my biggest hype person and be like, wow, that sounds like a really good day, you know. And you know, on the flip side, if somebody came to me and told me that their day was exactly like the day I had just performed, I would have been their biggest hype girl, truthfully, and to mean it,
that's
right?
what you would hope for your friends, right?
Yeah. So it's like, so why do we end up, you know, spiraling? And well, why we end up spiraling is a whole different podcast episode, but just to bring it back to the words that you use to yourself and the way that you talk to yourself, I think is just paramount and so important. Yeah,
like the reason of why you want to look for loose ends to tie up and look for things to do in your brain and take away from the joy and the peace that you had that day, like that's a whole different thing that we will talk a lot about, but not today. But yeah, the bringing it into practice with like I'm using a lot of the absolute words, I'm in my head looking for loose ends to tie up. Being aware of your internal dialogue, bring awareness to that, because that's your computer. Your brain is your computer, and if you just keep jamming in these formulas over and over, like q plus 8 squared m and like equal, and whatever that formula gets you, that's just what you're going to be thinking about over and over. So think of it like it's your computer, and these are the formulas that you keep putting into that computer, and if it's not getting the results that you want, then it's time to start inputting different formulas.
I think the journaling, to go back to words that you use in the journaling, I'm not a big journaler. I sort of have a journal that I will pick away at whenever I feel so inclined. I definitely don't do it daily, but I do think that writing down your thoughts is a very powerful way of making them real. And then when they're real, that sort of then gives you more opportunity to change them. It's sort of like, saying, I'm not a big believer in New Year's resolutions per se, but at the start of the year, if you want to create goals for the year, there is a big difference in just saying in your head to yourself things that you would like to accomplish over the course of a year, as opposed to writing them down, making them real, making them tangible, where you can go back and actually look at it throughout the year, equally as much as like saying it outwardly to, again, a friend, a family member, something like that, to really make them real. I think that's a great sort of piece of advice or tactic, is writing down the language that you use in your head so that you are aware of it. It's more tangible. It becomes real. Because there's something about, ideas just floating around in your head. They don't have to be real, right? You're like, oh, I could never say this to somebody else, and then it doesn't have to be a reality. So yeah, if you're looking to maybe change the dialogue that you use to yourself and the language you use to yourself, I think journaling would be a great place to start.
For
most
sure.
likely.
And that doesn't have to be like, sometimes journaling doesn't have to make sense at all. It's not a diary. Like, you're not making a diary for people to read. Sometimes it just means you put the pen down onto the piece of paper and you set a timer for 5 minutes, and you don't take the pen off the piece of paper for that time.
Right.
And you're going to use gibberish words, but it's just to keep it going. And it's kind of like a brain dump and a mind dump of like, yeah, there's a lot of gibberish in there, but if you can kind of sieve through it and look for some gold, like it's the gold rush.
Right.
Then maybe there will be some things in there where you're like, I guess my subconscious did have that rattling around in there. So that's a really good exercise. 5 minutes, 2 minutes, literally keeping the pen or the pencil on the piece of paper. And if you write cursive, then great, you can do that. And if not, then it's going to be messy.
Absolutely. I think another thing that's worthwhile talking about while we're talking about the power of words is the way in which we structure questions. And this is more in the context, we're getting away now from talking about the dialogue you use with yourself, but more the dialogue you use with other people.
Yeah.
And how we pose and ask questions in order to get perhaps certain responses, or at least valuable information.
Yeah.
There is you've written a blog post in the past. I think it's been on your website for a couple of years now, but I think it's called Where Conversations Go to Die, or something
where
like
conversations
that.
Go to die.
Where the conversations go to die. Maybe you want to people are certainly, anyone who wants to listen to this is certainly welcome to go look at it and read the full article on your website, but do you maybe want to give a brief synopsis about what you sort of get at in that article?
Yeah, it's basically, it starts with how. So those how questions, most of the time, those just lead to a brick wall, or at least like down the toilet, really, or it might get you barely into the door, through the door of the house.
So when we think about a how question,
how's
it going?
How's it going? It really depends on what it is
and where we're going.
But most of the time, like, that's how we ask people and greet people.
It's more a greeting than a question.
It's a greeting,
I think, most
right?
of the time.
So that greeting ends in like, good, you, or it ends in, I'm pretty good, you, or, oh, not so good. And then I'd rather somebody say not so good, so that we can actually deviate from just that dead end conversation, right? So when you start with how are you? How was your day? How was school? How was work? You know that's just going to generate like one word answers.
Well, and I think that's it intentionally, not intentionally, but it gives you the option to respond with a one word answer.
And most people will.
Yeah. So again, something I've adopted from you, but a way that you can change that is by saying, tell me about how your day is. Tell me about your day. Tell me about your day. right?
Tell me about school. Tell me
doesn't
about
allow
work.
for a one-word answer at all. There's no possible way you can respond with one word to tell me.
Yeah. Tell me about your day. Good.
Yeah. It's like, well, that didn't actually tell me
I'm
anything.
married to a Neanderthal. Good. But yeah, just the simple change of tell me versus how.
Right.
Don't give people the option. Like, let's say you actually want to know about people's day and you're curious, or you want to know how they did something, or this or that. And one thing I can guarantee you is that people generally do want to tell you about themselves, about what they're up to, their day. So give them the opportunity to do that by not saying how. Say, tell me. Like, what have you been up to since we last met? What's new? What's new is an interesting question, because if there isn't anything new, it usually leads to a dead end. But if there's something new, then it can open up a lot of new pathways. But that's like kind of tricky.
It's finicky. It's fickle.
But I like the tell me's.
I like tell me too. And I think we should also acknowledge that when you're in these patterns of how you've asked question and the language you use for probably your whole life, it can feel awkward at the start when you want to change that language. Like if all you've ever asked people when you see them is, "Hey Bob, how's it going? How are you?" To even just switch that to, "Hey Bob, tell me about work today." That can feel like it like anything, it takes practice. It feels a little bit awkward when you want to try and change that dialogue. You might, and to the people on the receiving end of that dialogue, you might get some funny looks at the start of like, "Tell me." Well, what do you mean, right? But like anything, it's just having to practice, and it will get more comfortable the more that you practice it and use it. And then I think, like anything with positive reinforcement, once you start having better conversations and better dialogue as a result of better questions, it will keep enforcing you to want to do it. Even in the context of me for work, using tell me has been a big game changer. So generally when I walk into people's homes for calls or hospital rooms and I'm interacting with them for the same time, more so in my paramedic job, because you're walking into unpredictable circumstances where you have to acquire a bunch of information and sort of quickly sift through what's useful and what's not in a short period of time. I actually start all of my calls with, "Tell me why you called 911 today," or "Tell me what's going on today." And then that allows for an open-ended question of people to literally tell me about what has brought us to this point in time or this circumstance. From there, then it's a bit of a juggling act to, decide if I want more lengthy, open-ended responses, or sometimes you got to reel it in with like, "Okay, you've given me a lot of great information. I really appreciate that. There's a few things I have to get through here now just for the sake of figuring out what my treatment decision is going to be, or which hospital we're going to be going to. So I'd just like you to respond to the following questions with a yes or no answer."
Yeah.
And I'll word it to them like that, because when people open up, you also don't want to like push them away and have them not open up anymore, but sometimes you gotta rein it in, right?
Of course.
I think also when you tell people, or I'm sorry, when you ask people,
When you tell people how their day was.
Listen, man. No,
when
you ask people those open-ended questions and you allow them to tell their story or tell their circumstance, along the way it can also give you a lot of valuable information if you're actually listening, that is useful later on in the conversation. So I just somewhat recently listened to an audiobook called Never Split the Difference by Chris Voss. Amazing book. That I would definitely recommend to everybody. Chris Voss is like an FBI negotiator, essentially. Former negotiator. And the book is phenomenal because it basically teaches you techniques that he's used in interrogations and with negotiating everything from hostages to, you know, working his way up the FBI and negotiating different salaries for jobs. And he just teaches you negotiation tactics that you can use in your day-to-day life that are very valuable. So one thing that maybe I was already doing in some capacity, but it definitely made me aware of it after using this book, is learning how to ask questions, but then also being very mindful of truly listening to the responses that people give you, because those responses can then be so much more valuable. Like, a lot of times people will give up information more than the words that they're actually saying, just in how they're responding. And then that is then information you can use later down the road to negotiate different things.
And what do you mean by that? Like, do you have an example of something like that?
So for example, if somebody, so say I did show up on, or here, I'll give you a different example. Somewhat recently, I was, something had happened at work that I just felt like there was an opportunity for change. There was an opportunity to change a procedure or a policy from what we're currently doing to something better based on this sort of adverse event. So I had emailed, now this isn't through conversation, I guess, per se, this was through email, but I promise I'll tie it back, how it can be valuable through email.
But that's the thing, you get, when it's text or email, you get even more time to choose your words.
Yes.
So that's a great, like, that's where you can easily apply all this information, is when you actually have time to sit and choose your words.
Yes.
When you're in the moment and actually speaking, that will come with practice, and it's never going to be perfect, nor should it. But the email and the text, you can almost perfect those. And when you're an FBI negotiator and people's lives are like at stake with how you treat people and the words that you say,
right,
people's lives are at stake, and you better be damn near perfect.
Absolutely. So yeah, that is a good point, just about taking the time with emails and text. And this goes back to I'll come back to the example. I'll come back to the example you asked me in a minute, but just while we're on this note, I think there is a pressure, whether it's from society or whether it's a pressure that we just sort of like put on ourselves, of having to respond to things immediately. And a lot of the times, especially if it's something important, or if it's an email that comes in that I am aware that's irked me the wrong way, or there's like a text message that I'm like, I don't like the tone of that text message, and you feel an emotion boil up because of words that you see on a screen, I think it's very valuable to take a break from that and let it simmer and go do something else before you come back to it and respond, because your response will be
emotionally charged
if you do it right away, which will lead to nothing good.
It's probably not going to be the best sound decision or answer if it's...
And it might not even be what you really want to say. That's the thing. When you're saying things out of an emotionally charged state, you might, like, things may just seem much more clear if you respond to it, not even the next day, but a couple hours from when you receive it.
Just take your mind off, be able to get your mind off of it.
And then come back to it.
Whether that's by sleeping or by, going indoor rock climbing or going for a run, or calling a friend and not talking about the email, talking about something different, or playing with your kid, or
doing your Zen garden.
Whatever, raking your Zen garden.
For anyone who also doesn't know what a Zen garden is, look it up. It's
just
cute.
Like a 1 by 1.5 rectangle with some sand in it. It comes with a little rake and some stones, and you just clean your life up.
Yeah, so we'll do a whole episode on Zen gardens too, but all that's to say is, yes, specifically when you have a text or an email or some sort of electronic interaction where literally there is no immediate response or no pressure to respond immediately other than the pressure that you're putting on yourself, do yourself a favor and take the time to separate from that before you give a response. That takes more practice when you're doing things in real time. But that is something that you and I have, I think, talked about and worked on even just in the context of our own relationship when you're having an argument or a disagreement or something like that. I know one thing I've certainly said to you is before you respond, take 10 seconds, take a breath, and then just have at least a conscious fleeting moment of, is this how I actually want to respond? Just ask yourself that question.
Well, we use words because we don't just cry like a baby anymore. Like babies can only cry.
Well, some people do.
Well, but babies
But
can
yes.
only cry to try to get what they want. And we have words now, but a lot of times we kind of treat it like just a, instinctive primal cry by using words. And it's like, well, no, I probably could have expressed myself better as opposed to just
lashing out with this like fury of words.
Calling, I won't say the word, but a hilarious and like hurtful example is when a baseball player on the Toronto Blue Jays, got fast pitch, so he was like in the box and he's kind of like waiting for the next pitch, but the pitcher fast pitches him. And then he yells the F word on like camera at the pitcher,
where it's been slowed down and everybody can see him say it. It was awful.
And then he like gets suspended and has to apologize to everyone. And it's like, no, probably shouldn't have said that. You probably should have been able to corral those emotions.
Just take a breath. Before you respond.
Yeah.
So the power of pause and actually the power of not saying words is also equally important.
Yeah.
But anyways, to go back to the original question of just how you had asked me of some real life examples. So I had this interaction at work. I thought there was an opportunity for a policy or procedure to change. I had contacted via email a higher up in the organization and expressed some concerns and proposed some changes within that. And I just sort of got some like a fluffy response of, oh, we'll look into this, we'll get back to you, like sort of
thanks for bringing it up,
thanks for coming out, but not like a real tangible answer.
We'll take it from here.
So that gives me some information just in the response itself. But then when I didn't get a response and more follow-up emails that I had sent just got no response back in general, that in and of itself, the lack of response gives me more information about what's actually going on, right? So one sort of thing I had implemented that I read from this Chris Voss book was when you're responding to either no responses or when you're responding to somebody who has sort of responded to you in like a chaotic way or, seems angry or like with those negative, like I'll call them on the spectrum of negative emotions for lack of a better word.
You want to bring attention
to
what's going on and what you've noticed without telling them how to feel or with putting words in their mouth kind of thing, right?
Yes, without putting words in their mouth. One really valuable sort of string of words to use is, it seems like, and then following it up with what you've observed. Even just using those three words together of it seems like is super valuable because you're not telling them what they did or how they did it. You're telling them what the situation seems like from your perspective, what I perceive. So it puts that back on you. And then after you say...
they can't deny it either.
They can't... Well, they can.
But your point of view.
So when you say it seems like it is your perspective... they can't take it away from you, but to also pay particular attention to what their response is to that, because if they come back and say, no, that's not what I said, or that's not what I did, you can follow it up with, oh, I didn't say that's what you said or did. I just said that's what it seems like to me right now.
Yeah.
But usually how they will, like, if there is something that they've been doing that's not ideal, or if they just didn't respond in the case of this email, they will follow it up with more information that, again, you can use going forward that may be valuable.
Right.
So I had sent an email. I sort of got these fluffy answers. I followed it up with 2 or 3 additional emails after that yielded no answer. So how I responded to the lack of answers was, good afternoon. It seems as though we're making no progress on this. Should I assume that this won't be looking into...
But you didn't use assume, right? I think you changed it. I think we talked about that, and you're going to use assume?
Yeah, maybe I didn't use assume, but it seems as though we're not making any progress on this. Is this matter no longer being looked into?
Yeah.
I think is how I worded it. And then very quickly, within an hour of sending that email, I got a response back of, oh, no, we're still looking into it. And then follow.
Right.
But yeah, just to go back to sort of how you can phrase questions, and then even within the responses themselves, there's valuable information you can use for more follow-up questions or how you're going to respond to people going forward.
Yeah. Words.
Another really valuable piece of information I learned from that book was to address, like, if there's something uncomfortable. So he was bringing this up more in the context of negotiating, like if you were talking about in a business negotiation where you have to deliver some news about, say, like a contract where you're not going to be able to pay the person as much as maybe they thought, or you're more in the concept of like negotiating money. Is sort of what he was talking about. And there's like an elephant in the room, so to speak, that you have to address that issue head on immediately. Like, again, so different than telling people how to feel, but if there's something that's actually real and tangible that needs to be addressed, addressing that before you go on with the rest of your conversation. So, you know, an example of that could be if you had asked me to clean the apartment when you went to work in the morning, and I didn't do it for whatever reason, and I knew that was going to upset you when you came home. Say, we'll lead it back to like separation of domestic tasks. When you come in the door, I can say something along the lines of, listen, I know the house isn't clean. I didn't do it today. I dropped the ball. Like, you might be upset at me right now for this and this and this, and like sort of putting that out in front, but here's what I'm going to do to resolve it, or can we talk about how to resolve it now? Sort of addressing some of those issues up front if you have to have an uncomfortable conversation, but like with things that are actually based in reality. We're not talking about the, you know, the absolutes and things like that. It's valuable to, sort of put that horse in front of the carriage to start, because then immediately people can't be like, oh, well, they already know. It's already out on the table. Now let's work more towards like a resolution of moving forward. Yeah.
And now that differs a little bit. It depends in the context and like the situation, because a lot of people will hear like the compliment sandwich, right? Remember the compliment sandwich?
Oh, yeah.
Where it's like, okay, I'm going to tell them something nice, and then the shit,
and
then something nice. But a lot of people kind of are expecting that now.
Right. It's been overused. The compliment sandwich has been overused.
For sure. But that's like one thing that has been used just by, okay, let's say something good, cushions the blow, then bad, then good again. But it doesn't really work that great. And that kind of brings me to the word but.
Ah, yes.
And
but
and B-U-T, not B-U-T-T, just B-U-T. And trying to replace your buts with ands. And if you can do that as often as possible, then it's going to be smoother sailing for you. Because if I tell somebody something I like what they're doing, if I have a compliment sandwich to give, let's say, or some piece of criticism, or I have to tell somebody something that we're going to change, you know, instead of giving them the positive and then saying, but we're actually going to have to go ahead and eliminate this section of the book. Like, everything I say before but is now irrelevant.
Null and void.
Yeah. So, but if I say and I know I just said but there, but if you say and, it includes everything in that you just said.
It's an addition to.
In addition to. And sometimes it doesn't make sense. Sometimes it makes more sense to say but or therefore. However, saying and is going to make your job and life a lot easier. And if you actually do have nice things to say to somebody and you also have something a bit more critiquing, you want that person to take the good stuff as well, then you have to say and. Because if you say but, then that defense mechanism goes up and that person's only going to be like, everything you said before is literally washed away. Now they're waiting for the bad.
Right.
And then they're going to cling on to that bad. So just do it as often as you can. Replace it with and.
And it does feel awkward.
Yeah.
That's a newer addition for me that I'm trying to change into my language. And there are times where your brain is like, well, these sentences don't string together. I don't like it. It's uncomfortable. But much like anything, it just takes practice. And in using those ands in difficult conversations I have had to I've noticed more of a difference for sure in just how people will respond to that information.
100%. Yeah. Because we're used to, but insert bad news, insert something that's not going to work out for me. So when you see a stop sign, what does that mean? That means stop. You know, so we encounter these things in our lives, and then we generate those patterns, and words are patterns as well, and types of words and sentences. So then we're used to a certain emotion coming with this word. So doing your best to practice that. You can practice it, and that's an easy, quick fix, just with and. One thing I did want to talk about was if somebody is asking for like your opinion or for advice, or let's say you have already been down this road and as that person, and you know the perfect answer for them, you know which way for them to go, and you want to give them that advice. Instead of giving them your solution, which they may or may not take ownership of, which most likely they won't, just stringing that advice as a question, or stringing in that advice with "I wonder." I wonder what would happen if instead of doing that, you did this. That's not you're just pondering.
Curious.
You're just pondering. You're just curious. And then that person can take ownership of it, because I know in that book you were just talking about, getting the other person to take ownership of the plan is the most important thing. Is get somebody to say that's right versus you're right.
Yes.
And that's huge. And like anytime you're trying to help somebody to change or help somebody, you want them to say like that's right, as opposed to you're right. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. Having you as the suggester be right, like you were sort of just alluding to there, doesn't force anyone to take any ownership of their actions. It's not their idea. We're all, we've all got an ego where we all sort of have to come up with our own ideas for them to be true for us. And yeah, just when you're asking, we've all had that situation where you have, a friend who breaks up with her shitty boyfriend for like, well, maybe you haven't. I'm saying this as a female, but you know, you have this friend, they break up with their shitty partner that they've already broken up with like 18 times that month, and they come back together and they separate, and they're always kind of coming to you to quote unquote look for advice. What's your advice? And you could spend all this time and effort giving like the most pristine, level-headed advice that like totally makes sense, and then the next day they text you and they're like, oh, we're just back together again anyways. Right? And then you can feel frustrated. Again, this is maybe diverting off path, we can get into that in another episode, but it's having people come up with their own answers and having good verbiage to ask the right questions to have people come up with their own answers is incredibly valuable. So yeah, that's some good that's some good advice. But yeah, it's some good advice to just be curious when people are asking you for advice. I wonder, you can literally say, I'm curious if things like that, to ask questions, to have them come up with their own answers is A, super valuable for them, but B, it also takes some of the sting and the hurt away from you as the quote unquote advice giver to be like, well, I just poured my heart and soul into this response and they didn't take my advice. Yeah. Now I just don't want to listen to their shit anymore.
Now I don't want to help them and listen to them anymore, right? Yeah. And that's good to do as well. If somebody just keeps coming to you with the same problem and you've tried all these different ways, if you haven't tried phrasing your advice as questions and being curious about it and asking and using I wonder, try that. And if that's still not working, they still keep coming with the same problems, it's bye-bye. It's no longer listening.
Well, I think another important point to consider is when you're asking these questions and we're saying, you know, be curious and pondering, of course you should actually be curious. Like there's hopefully you're actually curious, right? Because even if you are just changing around language and you're like, I'm curious, like people can still tell genuinity or not, right? So yeah, taking away some of the sting of not being heard if your advice doesn't get quote unquote followed, I suppose, but also being genuinely caring and curious will yield better answers and dialogue and conversation, which is really the whole point of what we want to be doing here anyways.
Yeah.
So
improving your quality of life.
Yeah.
By just changing and implementing and being aware of your words.
Right.
One thing I do want to talk about, because I'll hate myself if we end it without talking about it, but is the weather.
Oh, okay. Well, you go for it. This is your thing.
There's a reason why people talk about the weather, and that's because it falls under the category of environment. I won't get into the behavior model that NLP uses a lot. It's called neurological levels or logical levels, but basically it's a behavior model where depending on what stage the person is in, you can kind of dictate, you can see what verbiage and what words and how they're going to be talking. So when you ask somebody about the environment, the weather, some sun today, hot out today, that's like the base level conversation, just trying to get your foot in the door so I can have a conversation with somebody, and they're in the same environment as me, so I know that they're gonna probably respond.
We can literally relate to this one thing, if nothing else, because we're both in it.
Right? Unfortunately, most people never go up to the second floor. They just stay on that first floor of environment, and then once the weather talk is done, there's just like awkward silence, and then they'll be like, well, how about politics? That'll be a good one. Doorbell. But that is that base level of conversation, and if you're ever wondering why people talk about the weather so much, it's because it is in that environment level, that environment stage where everyone can relate to it. It gets your foot in the door, but your job is to graduate from that environment level quickly.
Well, and again, why do we start with the environment? Yes, it's something in that immediate moment we can relate to, but it also goes back to human needs. We just want to connect with other people, right? So we're looking for this like quick, how do we get in the door? We want to converse, we want connection. This is something that we can both relate to. I'm going to start there. But ideally, you progress past environment into deeper conversation, which would, I'm not familiar with the whole pyramid of logical levels, but what are some other things you could graduate to above environment?
So environment's base level, then it goes to behaviors, which, that leads to like, well, what did you get up to today? Tell me about your behaviors today. Or the behaviors you're going to do in this environment.
Sure.
Right? That's literally the next level. And the conversation gets a little bit deeper, We won't get into it all right now, because we have a few minutes left. But
I'm assuming from there it expands then into like values and
it
beliefs
goes to capabilities,
and the universe and
capabilities,
what is life,
beliefs and values,
right.
and one more level of just like spiritual and purpose.
Sure.
But people are doing that. They're asking about the weather. They're using just like that cut, copy, paste vocabulary. Because they are, it is part of their patterns, and a lot of people do want to build some connection, but that's not that connection is really only like $2.10 of gas in the tank. You want to be able to fill your tank up full, $50, $60, $100 if you got a truck. And you can do that by being more aware of the questions you're asking and the words you're using, and getting past that first level, that first floor of just environment, and you start to improve your relationships. You use so many examples of how to use it for work and to deliver news, and let the person decide if it's good news or bad news. And just improving the quality of your life with your vocabulary, and knowing that it's always work, it's always being aware of it, and it's never going to be perfect, but it's always worth it.
And be okay with it feeling awkward at the start while you're trying to implement some of these seemingly simple but more difficult than you would think changes. It's the same as changing any type of behavior, right? When you start working out, you're awkward, you don't know how to move your body in a certain way, you get sore, maybe you get discouraged, but don't get discouraged, just keep at it, and then it gets better and better over time. And it will change the quality of your interactions, and there go your life.
That's all your life is your relationships with people and yourself. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, babe.
Cool. All right.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.